Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So today marks the final in our Outcome Mapping Learning Community webinar series on bricolage. Today we're going to focus on bricolage and systems change. We've chosen this theme because it leads up to our OM Learning Lab event in December in Sri Lanka, where we're going to explore the application of bricolage and the MEL methodology. I'm going to post the event in the chat. In webinar 1 of our series, Bricolage and the Implications of OM and OH, we heard from Tom Aston and Marian Apgar, and they discussed the concept of bricolage, exploring what it means to design methods without boundaries, how the bricolage approach involves creating new fit-for-purpose methods by pulling from the heart of distinct but related existing methods, rather than adhering strictly to their original design. In webinar 2, OM and Bricolage, we heard from early developers and users and adopters of OM, Sarah Earle, co-author of the OM manual and the instrumental in early thinking of the method, and Julius Nyanga, former long-term OMLC steward and one of the original OM method practitioners. They discussed how OM was a confluence of methods, or bricolage, before the term even existed, and how OM arrived at a time when innovation was needed, enabling its impact to be more systematically proven. In today's webinar, we'll take that a bit further by exploring bricolage and systems thinking. Guiding us through this presentation are 3 core questions. Question 1, what do we mean by systems change, and what does success mean in this context? Question 2, why is bricolage important for systems change? And questions 3, what are the design considerations for MEL for system change, and how can we put these into practice? Before we jump in, let me introduce our speakers. Emily Gates is an associate professor of evaluation at Boston College. Her research examines systems approaches to evaluation, including the role and values and equity. She holds a PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And we're also joined by Pablo Vidueira, who is an associate professor of evaluation and food systems at Universidad Pontificia Comillas and director of evaluation at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. He's an agricultural and biosystems engineer, holding an MSc in rural development and sustainable management and a PhD in program evaluation. I'm going to turn this over to them so we can begin our lively discussion and webinar. Over to you, Pablo and Emily.
Great.
Thanks so much.
You, Sarah. Thank you, Simon. Okay, I'm gonna, let me just pause 1 second. I'll share a screen. Should we pin ourselves out? Oh, there we go. You did it for us. Okay. Okay, let me share a screen. We can still see chat, so feel free to raise questions or points in the chat. Now I've got it set up so I can see your faces as well. But you don't see my screen perfectly yet. How's that? Better?
Yep. Much
Okay.
better. Thanks, Emily.
So yeah, thank you again for the invitation. It's a real honor to be with Outcome Mapping Learning Community. Pablo is a longtime friend and colleague. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit more in just a minute. But we are going to start with our shameless plug for our new book, which is about evaluating system change. So I have spent, let's see, since around 2012, 2013, thinking about the intersection of systems science and evaluation. Pablo has been on a parallel path. We met as PhD students. Each of us were working on dissertations on the systems evaluation topic. And then just in the last couple of years, we put together this book. And so we're going to share some highlights and directly engage with the questions that Jared mentioned. Pablo, did you want to say anything before we get into the first one? What is system change?
Let's dive in.
Okay. I will add that as you heard, Pablo works at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. So he's going to weave in some examples from that, and we can come back to that as we get more into what does it look like in practice. So first, what is system change? Oh, actually, we have to give a shout out to Chris Lacey, who did the comics. Those of you in the eval space might have seen some of these comics. They're fantastic. A lot of them are about program eval, system science, and data viz. Or sorry, not system science, program eval and data viz. And so we had him do some new ones for the book. So we're going to show you those as we engage. So first one. So person on the left, my bike is making a loud clicking noise. Can you fix it? Person on the right, sure, just wear these. They'll block out the sound. So when we think about system change and defining system change, we first need to interrogate how we think about social problems and really the way these social problems are embedded in the world around us first. And so we're going to contrast in just a second what we see as the default assumptions in program and policy evaluation, assumptions that have undergirded a lot of the way we approach evaluation because of the way we think about interventions and problems, and say we need to define system change as an alternative to those sets of assumptions. So I also want to say that we use the phrase systemic change, and I'll talk about what that means in just a minute, but the label systems change can sometimes be conflated to just being changes to a system. And we're not just talking about changes to a system, we're talking about systemic as an orientation. So it's a way of seeing, it's a way of relating, and it's a way of working together in the world. And I'll unpack some of those assumptions in terms of system change and just systemic change. So this is the simplest way we could sort of dichotomize and contrast some of the assumptions that underpin program evaluation, policy evaluation, and those of you that are working implementing organizations or development organizations, oftentimes it's these kind of assumptions on the left too. So it's sort of this fix-it logic that we saw in the comic, where we really focus on isolating problems. What is the problem? What is the need? What is the gap that this intervention is going to address? How do we address it through individual behavior change? A lot of times our locus for change is shifting knowledge, attitudes, behaviors of individual people or groups of people. There are a lot of foundational texts in evaluation that start off saying evaluation is about incremental change. And so it's inherently a more conservative enterprise because we work within existing systems conventionally on that fix-it logic. Conventionally, evaluators hold the expertise. So do funders, so do implementing organizations, and sort of together change tends to be this top-down expert-led process. There's a linear process. We figure out what the social problem or need is or the disparity is. We robustly design and implement interventions, and then we evaluate them. So this conventional fix-it logic is very linear. We really focus on discrete solutions. Questions like, does this intervention work? Or does this intervention work for whom? But we're interested in interventions as discrete solutions. And the foundational definition of evaluation is judgment. What's the value of the intervention? How do we assess or judge the value? So the way we position systemic change is this orientation and a process, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. It's not about isolated problems, it's about dynamic situations. So when we think about complexity in the world, there's no inherent boundaries. There's no inherent prominence in terms of perspectives. There are these interconnections, multiple perspectives, dynamic situations, and we need to explore them to shift things. Systemic change is oriented to addressing root causes and conditions, often with a transformation aim. So it's not about preserving existing systems as designed or as operating. It's about addressing the root cause and condition, and that might lead to transformation. Systemic change is a much more bottom-up and participatory process. It needs to be collaborative. So it's sort of shifting from funders, commissioners, evaluators, implementers, policymakers, right? Like all those that traditionally are identified as holding expertise being centered, but rather communities and those that are affected by and directly engaged in the systems of interest, really leading the participation. It doesn't have a clear beginning, middle, and end. So it's much more adaptive and iterative, and it's about navigating those situations, which is different than saying it's a linear process or a stepwise process. In systemic change, it's not so much about getting interventions that work or getting interventions that have that are fixes or that sort of solve an issue that's been identified. It's more thinking about experiments and learning pathways within a context. And so then evaluation, which you might have heard in the systems change space, it becomes much more one and the same with inquiry and sense making. How do we make sense of where we are? How do we make sense of where do we want to go? What does it mean to develop value in light of where we want to go? And so the way that we talk about it is differing evaluation. Distinguished evaluation is like a judgment from this idea of evaluative inquiry to develop value. And that's really the heart of what we will be talking about. I also want to say, and I know I'm just going because I have this slide, but I'll pause in a second, Pablo, to see what you want to add. System change is not good. It's not inherently good. It's a normative term. It's a political term. So in evaluation and evaluative inquiry, the value piece is central. We'll talk about it just in a minute in terms of how we define success. But defining success matters because otherwise people think achieving system change is success, or showing that you've achieved system change is success. System change is not neutral. It depends on what success means to whom, whose values. So that sort of defining value is key, as well as the evaluative process. Let me pause and see, Pablo, is there anything that you want to lift up in this contrasting fix-it logic versus systemic change?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I think that just building on what you just said, like the normative side of systemic change, I think it's also important to, we have been talking about what it is, but it's also sometimes helpful to clarify what it is not, or what do we don't explicitly mean by that term. But systemic change, and as Emily was saying, it's not about something that is inherently good. We are surrounded by examples of systemic change that are driving systems towards really, harming outcomes to a whole bunch of people and the planet and other beings. It's also important to remind ourselves that it's not, the way we're presenting this term is not inherently good. It's not the solution. It's not something that would work in every context for every situation. Also, we have been doing some reflections around, sometimes we think about systemic changes. Oh, it's about the process. It's about how you get there. Yes, and it's about the impact as well. It's about what we achieve, which doesn't mean that you only achieve systemic change if it's something super big and the whole system and over a long period of time. Sometimes, systemic change takes the form of something that goes really deep and really shape how a system behaves and what are the outcomes that it's producing. And ultimately, it's not new. This is pretty old, and we're just trying to, wrap our heads around what does it mean and what does it look like in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Pablo. So the slide I'm going to show in a minute is going to first unpack systemic change as a process, but echoing what Pablo was saying about it not being new. So the system sciences have been fields that have paralleled. I mean, the outcome mapping community is already engaged in the system sciences and systems approaches writ large, but it's been in parallel to evaluation. So it's been around at least since the 1950s, originating across different fields. And very recently, this label of systems change has taken off. And so myself and some research students, we reviewed a lot of the system change guidance, because there's over 35 guidebooks, if you will, that are out there on how to do system change. And given Pablo and my book, and we are interested in system change as a process, what I will show next on this slide is these sort of 5 phases. So systemic change is both, it's like getting upgraded, so to speak, right? So it uses systems approaches and uses the system sciences, but there's been a lot more practical work on how to do it and what does it mean to do it collaboratively. So here you see a simple diagram. It's not linear in terms of where you start. In our sequence, we think about the bottom at the beginning. So I'm going to walk through these very briefly. But what we also want to point out is how evaluate, learn, and adapt. So another way we define systemic change is in the process. And it means, as I started to say, that you have to explore the situation and actually envision change. So there is this normative piece and this visionary piece around, what do we want? What are we aspiring for? What does better mean? What does better look like? And that initial phase is creative and fluid in terms of boundaries. The next one, see map systems on the left, is about mapping systems. So this is like using system diagram technique, systems mapping, but it tends to set boundaries and different boundaries to actually label the interrelationships, the variables, the factors within a system model. So systemic change designing as a design process means you've got to explore the vision, you've got to map systems, and then there's usually a kind of leverage point. So this is where we could talk about discrete interventions, although usually they're not one-off interventions. So the idea of multi-solving or portfolio-based change, where you think about clusters and combinations of initiatives at different scales and with different theories of change within them. And those together are supposed to co-produce or contribute to system level change. And then the fourth one, navigate futures. So when we were working on system change and systemic change, there is very little attention to futures. And so there can be a tendency to look back at systems as we understand them, or look currently at systems as we understand them. But it's also about strategic foresight and thinking about futures methods and future scenarios as they're unfolding. And then we position, evaluate, learn, and adapt at the very center. So we talked about systemic change as a contrast to the fix-it or the default way of working in policy and program evaluation. We talked about system changes and orientation, and that orientation is carried out throughout these processes. And then it's also a kind of higher level impact area. Again, Pablo, I'll stop. Yeah, so I see one comment too, in terms of, I thought systemic change evaluation examines the system in its entirety, and then we have to examine these complex relationships when examining how well a program addresses a problem. Yes, that's a great point, Guy. That is the case oftentimes, especially in how it gets used. What we're doing is emphasizing that if the interventions or the combination of interventions weren't designed with intentions to change systems in their entirety, so to speak, then we have to think about that as well. So we're sort of starting from scratch and thinking about systemic change as a process and what goes into the process, but it can also be about impacting the larger system or the system writ large. A lot of what you're talking about shows up in the systems mapping phase as well. Okay, so the next part of the question that Simon and Jared gave to us is, what does success mean? And we're gonna give you another comic to think about what does success mean. So this one shows a couple of people in a car, perhaps kids in the back. They look a bit smaller. And in the back seat, there's a question, are we there yet? And in the front, the driver is saying, that depends on how you define there. So this is how we see success in systemic change. Again, systems are in flux, right? There is change as a constant. It's not that we show up and then there's change and then we stop and then we assess change. Like, there are dynamic interrelationships unfolding. So it's a fluid process. In the process, we can pause at any point to say, what does success mean? And then, are we there yet, right? How would we assess success? So you can define and assess success in terms of the beginning. Are the right people around the table, so to speak? Is power shifting in the way those relationships are set up? Is there a clear idea or shared vision? Is there one or several systems maps that really do a good job in analyzing the systems of interests, etc.? So at any phase in the systemic change process, you can actually say, let's pause and see how it's going. In this sort of analogy with a road trip, right? It's not about the destination, it's about getting there and the journey. So the point is that you can pause on that journey and take stock of where you are and where you want to go, and how the journey itself is going. At the same time, I forget what our next one is. I think our next one is about bricolage. So we'll get there in a second. At the same time, you can say, here are the criteria that define system change as a higher level impact. And again, the sort of it depends piece of defining success there is that it doesn't matter so much what the definition is, it more matters how you got there. So who's engaged in defining success? What dimensions of success are included? So environmental impacts and ecological considerations is a big one that has to be factored into system change. Success has to be multidimensional. Oftentimes it has to be relevant across timeframes and scales. So it's less about the actual criteria and more about how you come up with them. I know some of you are probably like, that's not going to tell us what to do. And we're going to get into some design considerations in a minute. Pablo, I don't know if you want to talk at all about Global Alliance example or how you think about what success means any further.
Yeah, and I was thinking that I think it's the work really changes, and we can pick on that point later if people are interested. But I feel like there's a very big shift from, as an organization, working under the assumption that you know what value means, and you're advancing your notion of value and your notion of good, things look very different when you're starting to open up the discussion of what value means and what good means for a wider group of people that are engaging that system that you're aiming to change. That opens up new avenues of of work itself and new ways of working as well. That could be a topic for a webinar in on itself. But just to see a couple of ideas, and we can build on that afterwards if people have any other questions.
Do you want to say anything in the food system context, Pablo? I'm thinking about like me as someone not with expertise in that area. I will think about, oh yeah, my food system in New England, where I'm based in Boston in the US, like it needs to change. Big box grocery stores are right there. That's where a lot of the food comes from. We don't have direct relationship with farmers. I can think about what changing the food system means to me. But you're working on a global scale in terms of changing the food system. How do you think about like success in light of that food system space?
Yeah, I think that the confidence on the solutions decreases as you widen the outreach of those you work with. There's a whole bunch of organizations, not naming anybody, that position themselves as having the solution. This solution is to do this, or this solution is to do that, or this solution is to do this other way. And this can vary. Like this can be from, localizing food systems and reducing the use of chemicals. It could be all the way down to really intensifying the production of food and freeing up pieces of land for nature. And all those ideas are reasonable and defendable to some extent in specific contexts. But it's when with this notion of building together what good means and how we're navigating uncertainty and how we're navigating constant shifts in the system, that is a hard tension to hold, that erodes the certainty about, okay, we have this solution. You're constantly finding this solution. We at the Global Alliance having advocating for specific types of food systems for a long time. And it was recently it was really fun that happened in a meeting recently, discussing with other partners. It was like, do you realize that you're starting to sound as if you would have this solution? You have a set of things that you think that would benefit the food systems widely. So that means that you need to come back to this reassessment and scrutinizing what value means, what good means, who are you working with, and in what ways are you working with. Yeah, that's a very interesting topic.
Awesome. Okay. So we can still come back to it a little bit more too in terms of the design consideration. So the topic of this webinar is about bricolage, right? Bricolage and system change. So we've got another comic, and then we'll share our thoughts on why bricolage matters for system change. So this comic has two people talking, and in between them there is a kind of piece of artwork that looks like very jumbled. There's clay, there's paint, there's, I don't know, pencils, there's a variety of mediums. And the person on the left says, I could not choose a single medium or technique, so I used all of them. And the person on the right is thinking, I have no clue what this is supposed to be. So bricolage often gets talked about artistically, right? It's this creative process of combining elements of different methods. And so using this idea of art and combining medium as an analogy, we can then ask questions about why do we need to do that, right? In system change, where we recognize the complexity of systems and situations we're trying to change, we also recognize the social complexity, the fact that we're diverse as people, and in a democratic process, we need to engage with the different worldviews, cultures, values that we bring. So this sort of creative process of combining different things that actually fundamentally are different and make meaning or project meaning in different ways there's that layer of bricolage. We have to combine them because that's what system change is about. It's about engaging with complexity in different dimensions. But when we do that, we also need to be able to make shared meaning out of it, right? So if we use aspects of multiple methods that engage different assumptions, or let's say they define impact differently, right? Like there is a counterfactual way of thinking about impact where impact means you have a comparison group. And when you claim impact, you're attributing impact to an individual intervention. All that can be like behind the word impact. Someone else can view the word impact as being about impact, the people on the ground or the people directly affected and how they narrate or how they story the experience of what happened. So like a simple example, but when you combine different ways of defining terms and different methods, you have to be able to reach some sense of finding and some sense of navigational direction from that. And to do that, it has to be clear what you're bringing together, why you're bringing together, how you're bringing together, right? And also the framework for thinking about what rigor means, what transparency and process means, etc. So for Pablo and I, in the context of systemic change, it's about complexity, making meaning across different methods as we bring them together, and doing that in a way that's fit for purpose and context. So this slide doesn't get quite at this, but let's pretend that the artist on the left was actually working with a group. It was a sort of collaborative project. There were other people involved, and they designed this piece of art for a reason. That's the way a lot of NEL systems get set up or evaluation work happens. And so being clear about the purpose for the combination of methods is really important, being responsive to context. And in our understanding, or my understanding of bricolage, there's a lot of overlap with mixed methods. So good mixed methods, good mixing of methods really thinks about how and why you bring things together in terms of their underlying assumptions as well as their pragmatics. But mixed methods is oftentimes in like a research context. So it's more formal. It thinks about all the ways in which you can mix methodologies at different phases. And my understanding of bricolage is much more pragmatic and context driven. So you might do one iteration or one combination for this context, for this reason, for this audience. And then you go and you work in a different context and you do a whole new combination for different reasons. And so the bricolage piece is about, attending to complexity in that context. I'm hoping that Simon will have more follow-up for us in engagement and relation outcome mapping. But before we get to like design considerations, Pablo, do you want to say more about mixing or bricolage?
The only three things I would mention is that we when we were kind of trying to unpack how this could be done, of course we ended up on the on the bricolage, the mixed methods, the multi-methodologies ballparks. And I think that the reflections we are trying to make, and I think these are very much connected with reflections in this webinar series, that especially we know the work by Marina and Tom. And I think that for instance, this notion of inclusive rigor that they have been putting out is something we also build on, like reshaping rigor as something that, of course, allows for utilization and impact, but also allows for meaningful participation and engagement and inclusion. All that, made possible by this very intentional and well thought of combination of methods and tools. And it's, the question, I feel like we don't have too many answers to the questions that Marina and Tom were posing in the previous webinar, which is around, how do we create some safe space for that to happen? When a space for this to be transparent, to be well reasoned and well thought of and credible, and delivering very useful and practical evidence. But yeah, that's an ongoing quest, I think.
Awesome. So I guess what I want to add, I was just thinking as Pablo was talking, is that I can't think of good evaluation that doesn't combine methods, right? The idea of mixing methods to answer the high level evaluative questions is such, has such a long-standing way of working in the evaluation field. But in terms of system change, we're bringing in new methods, like we talked about systems methods. We're bringing them in relation to the phases of systemic change. A lot of those phases evaluators are unfamiliar with, and we need to engage with other partners and collaborators in doing that. And at the same time, we're employing the methods and the combination of methods or aspects of methods to answer questions about value, right? And to shape value development in a context. So what we're going to show next is getting at the third question that Simon and Jared have raised around design consideration. So it's not that anything goes. It's not like, oh, we're evaluating system change here, so we're going to do whatever we want that fits the context. We're evaluating system change over here, so we're going to do whatever makes sense to us that fits the context. But Pablo and I have struggled in working on the book to really think about like the plethora of evaluation models and approaches. There's so many different ways to evaluate, and there's a bit of a misnomer around anything goes in the system change space. And what we're proposing and arguing is not something new, but like the fundamental considerations for good evaluating need to be present when we evaluate system change. So these should be familiar to you. Oh, okay, we forgot to set it up a little bit more. I did. How do we evaluate systemic change? I will also say this is what everybody asks, and what they want is answers. They want a roadmap on how to evaluate systemic change. So another comic. Here, a person on the left says, can't you just tell us what to do and we'll do it? And the person on the right says, sorry, that's just not how this works. So particularly people like commissioners and funders who are like, I get it. We want to have system level impact. We've been working in this region. We've been working on this issue for a long time. And now it's time to show system level impact. Can you evaluate it or tell us how to evaluate it? We'll get those questions. And Pablo and I are like, no. First off, we need to slow down and say system change is not an add-on. Like, how did you design? How did you implement? How did you come together with others in shaping a process that was genuinely about engaging with the process of doing systemic change? And then at the same time, no, we're also not going to say, here's how you evaluate it, as if there's this cookie cutter way. But I said there are these sort of core elements that should look familiar to you. And that's what we have on this slide. And I'll talk through these and go back and forth with Pablo on them. And then I know we want to close with some of the constraints or the enablers for this process, because we recognize that not everybody in the evaluative role or the evaluator or MEL specialist role is able to do what we're talking about because of the spaces we work in. But at the top on the slide, you see sort of these icons of people with a star in the middle. This is going back to that idea that we see evaluative inquiry as fundamentally collaborative. It's not expert judgment. It's inquiry that people engage together about, are they doing the right thing? What makes this the right thing to do? How do they do better? And it's that inquiry, which is what we see evaluative processes focusing on. And then at the bottom, you see the messy-ish flow diagram between purpose, questions, value bases, evidence, and sense making. So when Pablo and I were reviewing across, like I said, the plethora of evaluation models, even thinking about good social science methodology and design, right? These are fundamental ingredients, fundamental aspects. You need to be clear on why you're evaluating or why the MEL system functions. Is it fundamentally driven by accountability? Accountability to whom? Is it about learning? Okay, learning about what, for whom, at what level, at what time frame? If it's about adaptation in light of what scenarios, in what unfolding futures. So getting some clarity of purpose and purposes, and then sort of two arrows point to the questions. What are the actual questions? We think if we're going to be about inquiry, then we've got to frame those questions in a way that really get to the heart of what people are genuinely wanting to answer. So this is also less about proving things that have already been shown, but rather genuine inquiry in terms of wanting robust answers to those questions. And then on the bottom, value bases. So what distinguishes evaluative inquiry and evaluation in general from research, particularly from applied research or social research, is that it's inquiry about value. So that means we have to define success or define value. We don't have time to go totally into it here. It could be criteria. It could also be normative maps. It could be principles if there are some agreed on ways of working or normative ways of working. There's different ways to have value bases, but this is where you actually be explicit about what success in the process or what success in system level impact means. And then there's the evidence. So this is where the bricolage really comes in relation to the questions, the value bases, and the evidence. Like, what does good evidence mean? What does rigor of methodology mean? And thinking about the combination of evidence that's needed, and then sense making. So it's not about the evaluator, so to speak, or one party interpreting the data and making claims. It's about how to actually co-interpret that in a process, make sense of it, and then figure out what does it mean for answering questions, and what does it mean for where you try to go next. So familiar, I'm guessing, but we unpack the varieties of ways you can do each of these things in systemic change, because that's where there are some new developments. Even though these are like longstanding elements, there are some new developments, and I talked a little bit about impact as one area, but yeah. Sorry, on Zoom, I have to sort of awkward pause and then be like, over to Pablo, because I can't see him right away to see what he's thinking or what he wants to add.
Yeah, and there are a couple of questions, but I don't know if we want to engage with those directly, or maybe we can just do a quick recap at the end, just to pick up on like to build on what was said before. I see that there was a comment on like the benefits of bricolage and the risks. I think that as I was saying on the chat, I think that the three big buckets that we try to unpack is the notion of advancing inclusive rigor as an alternative and complementary framing to the standard notion of rigor that Western science has imposed, and doing so in a way that is transparent and in a way that is leading to credible evidence. Like, there's a theoretically sound methodological bricolage that leads you to that inclusive rigor. I think those two, from what we have been researching, I think those three would be three really good signposts to advance a meaningful use of bricolage. And then there was a reflection that I will, I will not reread, but there was a very nice reflection on the relevance of using bricolage in specific cases tethered to, working across different contexts and working with what you have, which is absolutely true, and keeping options open so you can really advance a meaningful network. Yeah, I think that on the 5 elements, yeah, I think that probably that's good for now, and we can maybe move to the conditions and then open it up for questions. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm actually going to stop sharing because I know we're at time, and I want to engage with Simon, but we can. Yeah, so let's do that. In the PDF that will be available of the slides, you have a link to our book. I mean, I said it was a shameless plug because we're excited. We've spent some years working on it. We've thought about this for a while. And what we're not talking about now is the conditions, as Pablo mentioned, the constraints. So we explore like what's necessary at a team level, an organization level, a partnership level, and a more macro marketplace level to actually work on systemic change as a process and to evaluate it, because it's not the world most of us live in because of that sort of fixed it default way of thinking about social problems and addressing them. So anywho, we can talk more about that too, but there are risks and there are constraints for sure. Thanks, Simon. Now I see you nicely.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Thanks, Pablo. It's I think it's great to get into this topic because I mean, I for one have begun to use the language of systems change in my own work, but also when talking about outcome mapping in trainings and in discussions in the outcome mapping learning community, and I think it helps to have someone who's sort of studied this for a long time to come in and give us some structure, I think, to help us understand if we're actually using this correctly in the right way and thinking about this. And I guess thinking about all of the the range of issues around systems change that we might be blinkered away from. So for me, I just wanted to share 3 reflections that kind of tie this in with outcome mapping. So I want to share one thing that I think, hearing from your introduction there, about what I think outcome mapping already does quite well, and which is a reason you might want to use outcome mapping in your MEL system in a sense as one of the pieces of bricolage. And then I'll share one thing that I think OM is already doing well in bricolage, a sort of an example of active bricolage, and then one potential for future bricolage inspired by what I've been hearing. So one thing I think OM does well is helping us shift away from seeing the world through the eyes of our intervention and actually seeing it through the eyes of the system. So I think the vision step, kind of the first thing you do in outcome mapping, is you bring people together and find out what our common vision is for the system, or you're negotiating differences of opinion about what the vision for the system looks like. And your goal is to have a collective vision. It's not saying this is our organization's goal or this is the objective of our intervention, but it's saying this is our collective vision. And I think that reflects quite nicely what you were saying in terms of systems change. And I think that's sort of followed through in outcome mapping with the boundary partner step and looking at outcome challenges, which is understanding what does change look like through the lens of different actors in the system. So that's what I think outcome mapping does well, and I think, which is one reason you might want to bring this into your system, your MEL system, that is. And then one thing I think outcome mapping is already doing, I think that the creation of outcome harvesting 10, 15 years ago was actually born out of the fact that in outcome mapping, outcome mapping kind of creates this very strong connection between the theory of change and the monitoring data, which doesn't always work well because your theory of change is, or the change that you're engaging in is very dynamic. And so in systems change, there's often high levels of uncertainty and emergence, which means you can't just monitor your change pathways, you have to be adapting. And in outcome harvesting was created by Ricardo Wilson Grau for that reason, because he wanted to sort of separate out and not tie the monitoring down to any kind of theory of change or framework. And people are still doing that. So people use OM and OH together, where you can create the theory of change with OM and then do the monitoring with outcome harvesting, and you're not tying the monitoring down to that framework. So that's sort of one thing. And we did a webinar on this a few months ago, back at the beginning of the year. So you can have a look at that recording if you're interested. And then one area for future bricolage, I think, is one of the 5 circles that you showed was navigating futures. And I think outcome mapping does 4 of those circles quite well. But futures, it doesn't have a strong sort of methodology for helping you ask the so what question. What do we do now? There's kind of reflection questions thrown in there, but there's nothing structured. So I think, there's an idea there for bricolage outcome mapping with something that does bring that futures thinking, scenario planning, where you can connect your monitoring through to future action at a strategic level. But yeah, that's just one sort of inspiration that I got from hearing from you. Also keen to hear from anyone else if you have thoughts on those things as well. So we have 15 minutes left, so we can have another quick check-in with Emily and Pablo. But any participants, if you want to post your questions or comments, engage in this discussion a bit further, we have a bit more time for that.
And while people are putting their thoughts in order to say those out loud or in the chat. I just wanted to speak about on what you just said, Simon, on the futures component. I feel like that's a very important area for the field to engage with. Like, we don't have that expertise, generally speaking. That is not part of our training, our, the things that we are expected to do on a daily basis. And it's very important. And I feel like we are well positioned to lead on those spaces. Like, the learning component is a kind of process to link, what we have done and what does it mean into the future. And if we just add a layer in which we are actively imagining collectively how those futures may look like, and how those things that we are learning may unfold into those plausible or possible or desirable futures. And it sounds daunting, and it's not that hard. It's just we are just trying to experiment with those things at the Global Alliance, and it's just layering things. Like, we have these kind of reflective spaces, which were mostly about, okay, what are we learning? What does it mean? What, how are we like applying those things that we learn into an ongoing basis? What does it mean in terms of strategic opportunities? But it's just layering this kind of, reflection pieces. And it's a really powerful small thing to add. Yeah, just to build on what you just said.
Yeah, thanks, Pablo. And there's a question in
one person. Yeah, go ahead, Simon. I'm seeing a more recent one too.
Yeah, so you've responded in chat to Titia. Phil and Mariam Smith ask, building on my reflections, how do you see outcome mapping as developing the kind of systems perspective you have discussed? What does it miss and therefore need some bricolage?
I think that a very basic like point upon which we can build the response is that there's no perfect methodology, as Emily and I were discussing. Like, like, there's simply no way in which we can engage with this kind of multi-dimensional, multifaceted process with just one tool, like with a hammer on our heads. So yeah, I think that as Simon was putting that, I feel like there's a nice combination about, the mapping, the boundary, the boundary setting, and the mapping part of the outcomes, as you very well described, Simon. And there's this other, like, sister methodology that kind of frees yourself from the theory of change and allows you to explore things in a more kind of open way. That is a bit of bricolage right there. And then what we are proposing is also, like, layering the mapping of the system, not just the outcomes, but, like, really understanding what is the system in which we are operating. And that could be done through a million different methods before entering into the mapping the outcomes piece, which is very well developed in the outcome mapping methodology in the community. And there's also the futures piece. Like, there are also a lot of methodologies. Emily and I were exploring, like, the 3 horizons, which is a framework that is becoming super popular right now. But there's so many ways and methods to embed that into a bigger or longer process. But Emily, over to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm reflecting on that question and other things in the chat. I mean, to me, the what does it miss is really important, that Phil and Miriam are asking. And it also is connected, I think, to Titia's comment about wanting to think about navigating paradoxes and clashes and tensions. My own sort of orientation in mixed methods, one of my mentors was Jennifer Green, who wrote a lot in the US about mixed methodology. And she talks about mixing mental models. So it's really thinking about fundamentally how people construct the situations they're in. Like for any quote problem, there are people who don't see it as a problem, right? And so that's why we try to get away from the problem solving logic or language and think about the complexity of situations and the multiplicity of worldviews, the paradoxes, the tensions. So to me, it's the extent to which you're seeking convergence in the outcome mapping, or that you're really carving out space for divergence. So to me, one of the points of doing bricolage or combining things that are fundamentally different is because they allow people who see and experience the world differently to sort of coexist within an inquiry process. And I mentioned critical systems heuristics in terms of boundaries in the chat. Like that's just one that I happen to be familiar with, and it's got specific purposes, but boundary setting sometimes can be about boundary setting. Like, let's get to the boundary so we can get on with outcome mapping. I'm not saying that you practice it in this way, but sometimes boundary exploration can be a means to a bigger end of getting to the outcomes, right? But in thinking about divergence and tensions, it's how do we then do outcome mapping in a way that allows for the contradictions and allows for the divergences? Sometimes it's not possible within one methodology. Like you actually have to think about methodologies that, like in that mixed medium comic, like they really don't make sense immediately together because they're so different. But then you have to construct an idea of rigor that transcends them, that goes across them. But in the inquiry, you're combining to hold that space. So anyways, that's sort of some of how I think about what might be missing and what could be added. I know there's a couple more. Yeah, let's pause. And Simon, if you've got to read it.
Yeah, so there's a question from Sam Sewell. I think it's more about outcome mapping. I am working in development sector for the last 5 years in meal and program in different national and international organizations. But why outcome mapping and harvesting and not contextualized in project design? Are we avoiding this? And if there is any project with OM or OH, somehow it's not implemented. So there are lots of cases of outcome mapping and outcome harvesting being used in project design. And there are some on the outcome mapping learning community website that you can find. But there may be two reasons why you're not seeing it more systematically. One is, I think as soon as someone comes along and says, this is our standard approach and you have to use outcome mapping, you have to use outcome harvesting, something happens and the magic is lost. This is why IDRC, who developed outcome mapping, never did that. They never mandated it as an approach. So I think the cases where that does happen, it just doesn't end up being that interesting and written up. So most of the cases we have are where outcome mapping and outcome harvesting are introduced by champions, and that may be something that is important in systems change as well. That you need these champions to sort of stir up and inspire the use of these methods. Because as long as someone comes along and says, "This is how we're doing it," bam, 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 you don't get the collaboration and the spark that's needed, I don't think. So I think, yeah, there's the skill of the facilitator, I think, is one important piece of the picture that this is suggesting to me. But there's another reason it might just be because they're not being written up. So there may be some good examples out there, but they're not being shared and written up. And sometimes that's just the case, I'm afraid. And yeah, are there any other questions? Just checking chat.
I can lift up one that someone said earlier around the scale question, like that the systemic change phases could be applied across individual development as well as big community or world matters external to the self. I think that point Jason makes is really important because sometimes we can feel, I mean, myself included, I work at an academic university. I often feel powerless to engage in systemic change because I'm one faculty member. I have autonomy and some influence over my classroom, the program I direct. Beyond that, it seems really hard. And all of us are located in institutions that are part of wider systems in that way. But if we think about systemic change as a process that we can do it across scale, then it does give us some agency and also some intentionality around it. So like, even if we do things within the parameters in which we can shape and we have influence, we can still do them with the wider idea of system, and our thinking about our relationship to system, and do that purposefully within the process. So just like wanting to echo their point and say, I think that's one way in which we can navigate the constraints that we're in as well, to think about, are we working in a way that models the type of systemic change we wish was happening at other scales, but still just be able to do it in the spheres that we're in.
Yeah, and maybe then just one last question, which I did get a bit of discussion in chat, but there's a question from Wenjin. While I see many benefits of using bricolage, I wonder, are there any risks to manage?
Well, I can quickly say, I think the risk was in that comic too. Like, the risk is that, and I think it's happening, people say, oh, that's just a hodgepodge, anything goes. Like, there was no rhyme or reason why you combined what you combined. I mean, it can take more expertise, it can take more resources and time, or not, depending on the design. But it can be really misinterpreted if someone can't make sense of the process or what it concluded. And I think that that's why it has to be paired with this idea of inclusive rigor and a very clear sense of what the value bases were, what the evidence bases were, how it's fit for purpose, how it answers the questions, et cetera. To us, that's part of how you manage those risks, which are that, you ask too big of questions that then you can't do something well, or they take too much time or resources, or you do something well, but it's not set up in a way for others to understand what doing it well means. I don't know, Pablo, if you had any thoughts on that risks question as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's it, and the few other things that we just shared. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
And I think, yeah, looking at Tishia's comment as well about just the challenge of doing this practically in a space where you get a lot of pushback. There's not a lot of cooperation, and just bringing in new ideas is very hard. You know, there's this inertia you've got to overcome, or several inertias, as Tishia's been commenting. So I think again, there's a definite skill of the facilitator in bringing this in, and navigating that bricolage process. And I think that's true in outcome mapping, and it's true in any methodology, that there's good implementation and then there's not so good implementation. And a lot of it comes down to the skill of the facilitator.
So I want to thank Emily and Pablo for joining us today, and Simon for his insights. I have posted the link to our event in Sri Lanka, as well as the link for the 2 other webinars related to bricolage. This webinar will be available on the same website within, let's say, a week, Simon, possibly?
Yeah, usually a week.
Yeah, usually a week. So you'll be able to go back and look at it again. And as Emily said, they will be sharing the slides in PDF form via that website as well. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and we really appreciate it. And, get out and evaluate.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Jared
much.
and Simon, for the invitation.
Yeah, thank everybody.
Great to have
Ciao.
you with us today, Emily, Pablo. Thanks everyone for joining.